morning, good afternoon, hello, this is Bob Borchard. We're in Old Town Mariposa, and I have with me Dr. Leroy Anthony Westerling, a climate scientist from UC Merced. And Leroy and I have been talking, exchanging information now for several months about climate science and where things are going. And I thought it would be fun if the two of us could get on camera and talk a little bit about what you've been looking into and what we're in for.
Okay. Well, my area of expertise is really on wildfire, right? Which is appropriate for Mariposa. So California, unlike a lot of other places in the country, has its own state climate assessment program. Primarily funded by the California Energy Commission, but also by the state legislature. Okay. And we are in the lead up now to the 5th state climate assessment, which is going to provide communities and policymakers and private industry, and basically everyone in the state who's interested, with a lot of information, not just about wildfire, but about agriculture, about water supply, wildfire direct impacts, and sort of secondary impacts like how it affects water supply, how it affects air pollution and public health, all kinds of things. And all that is really happening out in like 2024, say. But it takes years of preparation for each iteration.
2024.
Yeah.
That's 4 years from now.
Right. But we've been working on it for years for 2024, and we'll be still working on it for years more to get it right. So we're doing things like modeling simulating what fires are going to look like in Mariposa and other places around the state under all different kinds of climate scenarios, but also how we manage the landscape, how we manage fuels, where we let people build their houses, how dense that development is, how many people there are, where the roads go, all kinds of factors play into that.
What about wildlife, nature?
So the work I do directly relates to that because for example, in the Sierras, we have endangered species, like for example, the California spotted owl, and you have to, consider what the impact is on them, not just of climate change, but of anything we do to manage the landscape. So a lot of our work is used to understand how fuels management on a landscape, so mechanically removing dense fuel, or using prescribed fire or wildland fire use to thin the fuels, could impact those species both directly, like do they like the sound of chainsaws and do they like having fire near their nesting sites and things?
Or they get burned up.
Right, versus if we don't do that, what happens to the sustainability of their nesting sites? Are they going to get high severity fires in there that just wipe it out for decades on end? So we've been working in that area for years in the Sierras here, and that's continuing with support from the California Department of Fire and Forestry.
Okay. We have species now that are becoming endangered because temperature changes. The drought cycles have affected their habitats. Mm-hmm. And have you gotten into that very much, just as a non-wildfire related issue?
So places like California have really high biodiversity, and that's partly because of the kind of climate we have, this Mediterranean climate, and it's also the topography. We have really steep elevational gradients from the coast to the crest of the Sierras, and so there's a lot of narrow bands of different habitat types as you move up slope, and they have their different climate associated with them and everything. But what that means is that there's fairly small patches on the landscape that different species currently use. And as you warm up the climate and make precipitation more variable, that's also part of what we do with climate change, you're shifting where they're going to be comfortable on this landscape. And that means that in places where they've been, what we say endemic, where they've been present on the landscape for a long time, they may not they may not be able to persist there and keep using that part of the landscape. They may have to go somewhere else. And since our landscape's all broken up with different patterns of ownership and different types of management and infrastructure cutting through it and everything, that it's very difficult for these species to
migrate.
move and migrate. And then because of the speed of the climate change,
They haven't been able to adapt.
they can't really move that fast. Like trees don't walk, right? They propagate and some of them do well in some part of the range and less well in other parts, and that's sort of a slower shift. The pace of climate change currently is much more rapid than anything that these species are adapted to. People will often say, well, climate's always been changing, and that's completely true. Throughout the history of the Earth, the climate has always been changing. What's important to think about is, like, why is it changing and how fast and how much, right? So right now it's changing quite a bit, very quickly, right? And because of human activity. So that means that it's very difficult for a lot of species to adapt or migrate or adjust to the changes. But it also means that we hold some responsibility because we're causing it. And if we moderate our behavior, we can make it happen at least a little bit more slowly, give them a fighting chance. So.
Yes. This past few years has been kind of a setback in that department. But I don't want to get political here. The reality is, though, that when you're talking about adaptability, you're talking about the human species as well. And we bring into it the realities of limiting our water supply because of the drought, and that was a part of what started this conversation. Drought no longer is a relevant word for the water cycle that climate change has brought California.
Right. So California has always been a relatively arid place, right? It's dry. It has a Mediterranean climate, so it has a dry summer in particular. But it's projected to get a lot drier.
Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll be coming to you again with some more discussions on this subject.